Going. Thanks everybody for coming. Very nice to see you here. Little bit of housekeeping before we get going. If anybody's new to my talks today, I'm not going to be keeping an eye on the chat or the Q&A box during the talk, but there will be time for questions at the end. If you do have a question, please pop it into that Q&A box, and I will go there first at the end of the talk and do my best to answer your questions. And if and when we get through all of those, I'll go back to the chat and we can carry on talking there. You can ask your questions at any point during the talk, by the way. Of course, just bear in mind that I won't see them until the end. So yeah, thanks very much for joining me. This is a talk actually that I've had it in mind to give for quite a long time. I've been holding off because towards the end of 2019, and in fact into 2020, in January 2020, I did a bit of work on a 6-part series on mummies for Channel 5 in the UK. It was a co-production of Channel 5 and various other broadcasters around the world, as these things usually are. I was expecting that the series would have aired in the UK by now, but it hasn't. It has been, I think, on elsewhere around the world, but not in the UK yet. So I've been hanging on, thinking, you know, when it's announced that the series is coming on, then I'll do the talk. That would be a nice moment to do that. But I've run out of patience, so I'm doing it now instead. This has been a popular lecture, a popular talk. Lots of people registering, which is great. I'm not really surprised because mummies, and I suppose particularly royal mummies, are a kind of archetype of ancient Egypt, aren't they? If you know anything about ancient Egypt, you probably might call to mind mummies, the mummification process, this incredible means of preserving human remains to the extent that they've survived in pretty good condition down to the present day. And museums that include in their collections human remains from Egypt often find that they are among the most visited items in their collections. That's true in the British Museum, of course, where there's one or two quite iconic sets of human remains. One thinks of the mummy that's got the name Ginger in the pre and early dynastic displays, and of course in Cairo. And actually there was another prompt for this lecture, although I'm a bit slow on the uptake when it comes to this one, in that a few months ago the Royal Mummies, the collection of Royal Mummies, was moved from where they had been on display since 1994 to a new home. So they had been in the Egyptian Museum on Tahrir Square. This is a part of Tahrir Square here, and the museum is the pinkish looking building in the background at top left. The mummies had been on display, as I say, in specially dedicated spaces at either end of one section of the first floor in the museum, in air-conditioned, climate-controlled rooms. They have moved now to a new home at the newly created National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. There are going to be 3 museums in the Cairo area, 3 very big, large museums of ancient and historical objects in the Cairo area, pretty much from now on. The existing Egyptian Museum on Tahrir, the one that we're looking at here, the Grand Egyptian Museum, which is of course where the majority of the really high profile ancient objects are going to be put on display, and the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, which is intended to cover all periods of Egyptian history, not just Pharaonic, but Coptic, Islamic, etc. And the Royal Mummies are going to be the biggest attraction, I think, for the NMEC. And so in a with great ceremony in April this year, the Pharaohs Golden Parade was organized as a kind of celebration of this transfer, and each of the royal mummies was given its own little modern version of a chariot, and they paraded across Cairo from downtown by the river in the direction of the Mokattam Hills, and the NMEC sits at the bottom of those hills, roughly at the bottom of those hills. And they are now on display in their new home. So I gather I haven't been able to visit myself, of course, thanks to the pandemic, but I hope it won't be too long before I get to see them in their new home. So what I wanted to do today, one of the things I'll be interested to see when it is possible to visit the NMEC is to what extent the mummies are displayed along with the other material that they were discovered with, most obviously the coffins, but other burial equipment, which was found principally in one of two caches towards the end of the 19th century. So the royal mummies that we're talking about here are the mummies of the kings, yes, pharaohs, yes, but also their queens and a number of other high status individuals from the later 17th dynasty towards the end of the second intermediate period, the 18th, 19th and 20th dynasties, the New Kingdom, and into the 21st dynasty as well. As we shall see, the last activity in these caches actually relates to a period as late as the early 22nd dynasty. But I suppose the most famous of the royal mummies are those of the most famous of the New Kingdom kings and queens, individuals like the great warrior pharaoh Thutmose III, the great Amenhotep III, the warrior kings of the beginning of the 19th dynasty, Sety I, Ramesses II from the 20th dynasty, Ramesses III, and so on and so forth. As I say, the majority of those were discovered in two caches. One of them is Theban tomb number 320, which is, as we shall see, close to, not quite a part of the bay of Deir el-Bahari, but close to it. It's therefore often referred to in the literature as DB 320, but it's part of the main Theban tomb numbering sequence. So personally, I prefer TT 320. It was known to the Antiquity Service from 1881, as we shall see, but it had been previously discovered by Ahmed and Mohammed Abd al-Rasul, who had been quietly and carefully removing objects from it in the years, an unknown number of years leading up to that point. The second of the caches was a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, discovered in 1898 by the French excavator Victor Loret, one of the great discoverers of tombs in the Valley of the Kings, working on behalf of the Antiquity Service. This was the tomb of Amenhotep II, and indeed contained his mummy in place in the sarcophagus in the main burial chamber, but it also was found to discover a cache of a number of other New Kingdom royal mummies, the mummies of kings, and also a number of others, as we shall see. Most intriguingly, the group of three unwrapped mummies that includes the elder lady and the younger lady, whose mummies have caused so much interest among those who are fascinated by the Amarna period in particular. The elder lady turns out to be Queen T, the wife of Amenhotep III and mother of Akhenaten. We're going to focus today on TT 320. When I initially thought about doing this lecture, I thought it might be possible to cover both the caches in detail, but it wasn't long into the preparation for this talk that I realized there was no way I was going to be able to do them both justice. So today we're really going to focus on the first and the larger of the two, and the one which in some ways provides most information about what was happening at the end of the New Kingdom and into the 21st dynasty, how these caches came to be created. And it's also this one, rather than the KV35 cache, that's generated most discussion and ongoing argument about how events should be reconstructed. So, as I say, I wanted to think of the sort of starting point for this talk today as being the fact of the royal mummies. You know, we have these mummies, we have the bodies of the pharaohs, and that's well known, and you can go and see those mummies now in the NMEC in the Egyptian Museum, the way they were displayed up until recently, you were really looking at the human remains. And I suppose the idea of the display was that you could marvel at the fact that these are the very bodies of these important people from the ancient world. Some of them among the best known and best attested figures in the ancient world: Ramesses II, Sety I, all those people I mentioned. The fact that they're preserved, the very fact that you can look at the faces of these people. Face of Pharaoh is a phrase that we often use in Egyptology. Is kind of marvelous in its own right. But I've always been a little bit bothered by the fact that the mummies are so much divorced from their archaeological context. And I've talked about this kind of thing before. It slightly bothers me that the material, for example, from the tomb of Tutankhamun is displayed in very much a kind of museum way, so that each of the pieces is exhibited almost in isolation, and you can look at each of these things in wonder, but it doesn't tell you very much about the archaeological context. And things have improved in the Egyptian Museum. There are display panels, and some of the Harry Burton photographs are visible around the displays, so that you get a sense of where things came from. But inevitably, there's a sort of sense of separation. And I think in the case of the Royal Mummies, that's particularly acute. A lot of the coffins that the mummies were found in are on display in the Egyptian Museum, and in fact not very far away, but there's not much to tell visitors that those things were originally part of a whole, part of an archaeological context. So what I wanted to try to do today is as often with these talks, is reverse engineer that, so that we get back to the point of the archaeological discovery and not just the objects as they are displayed in the museum now. And the story starts in the 1870s with this man, Frenchman Gaston Maspero, who was the director of the Antiquities Service across two stints, in fact. The first beginning in 1881 to 1886. He then returned to Paris to pursue a career in teaching and scholarship in Egyptology. He was a very great Egyptologist in his own right. He then returned to take over the Antiquities Service again from 1899 to 1914. And if you know your history of Egyptology, you will know that this period, in general, was a period of, it's the sort of great era of discovery, if you like, in Egyptian archaeology, the archaeology of Egypt. It's a period during which serious scientific excavating, well-documented excavations begin to take over from the more industrial treasure hunt type excavations, and discoveries were being made up and down the country. And as the person at the forefront of all this, as the director of Antiquities, the Antiquities Service, Maspero has access to all these new discoveries, and he was a scholar worthy of that. And his publications track record is terrific, and he added very, very greatly to our knowledge of ancient Egyptian history. As part of his brief, as would have been the case for anybody involved in the academic side of things, rather than treasure hunting or collecting, the more sort of commercial end of activities in Egypt, Maspero would have had an eye on the antiquities trade. There were laws in place in Egypt by this time, by the 1870s, 1880s, to prohibit illicit excavation. So it was supposed to be the case that the only excavations going on were undertaken with the permission of the Antiquities Service. But clearly lots of illicit digging was still going on, and there was lots of material newly excavated, or which had been excavated in the past and kept secretly in people's houses, that was being sold on somewhat under the radar to mostly Western travelers and visitors who were looking to pick up souvenirs. And so it was in the interest of Maspero in particular, but anybody in academic Egyptology, to keep an eye on what was going on, partly so that they would be aware of new material, also though by extension so that they would be aware of new sources of material as well, sites which had perhaps been discovered by illicit means, but which might have been in themselves important archaeological sites. And with an eye on the market, Maspero began to notice in the 1870s that something was up in Luxor. And it's a well-known part of the story, actually, of the discovery of the royal cache, that material had come onto the market in the period leading up to 1881, the same year that Maspero became director of the Antiquities Service. It's not often, though, made known what the details of this were. And so actually, in preparation for this talk, I decided I would try and gather all this stuff together, actually. And fortunately for me, a friend and colleague of mine, Cynthia Sheikh-al-Islami, has in fact done the groundwork on this. And in an article from a few years ago in a feshrift for the Egyptologist Tokhfa Handusa, she published an account of all the material that seems to have come onto the market in the 1870s, which essentially provided the clues for Maspero that something had been found. So in 1874, Maspero noticed a series of blue glazed figurines like this one coming onto the market, the antiquities market in Paris. This is an example which is in fact now in the British Museum. It was eventually made its way into the collections of the British Museum. As you can see, it's a fairly small, simple-ish Pharaohs Shabti figurine. It bears a cartouche in the short inscription on the front, and the cartouche is of a Karkepera Sety and Amen. Karkepera is a pre-nomen, a coronation name, which was held by two royal individuals in Egyptian history. One of them, I think, the Middle Kingdom Pharaoh Senusret II, if I remember rightly. The other of them, the priest king of the 21st dynasty, Pinugem I. This Shabti is very much of the 21st dynasty style, so it was fairly obvious that this was a Shabti of Pinugem I. So evidence of the burial, the tomb of this important figure from the 21st dynasty. In 1876, not long afterwards, Maspero was shown a papyrus, the Campbell papyrus, named after its owner at the time, which turned out to be a part of the Book of the Dead of Pinugem II. This is not the whole of the papyrus. This would have been a much, much longer roll. Things were cut up into sections, often by the people who found them, in order that they could be sold off in bits. There are a number of fragments in the British Museum. This is probably the most iconic, with an image of Pinugem II making offerings to Osiris at the right-hand side here. This is also now in the British Museum. A year later, Monsieur de Saulcy gave Maspero photographs of a Book of the Dead papyrus, this time belonging to Nojmet. Nojmet was a high-status lady in the early 21st dynasty, married to another of these priest kings, Herihor, and possibly also to another, Herihor's either immediate successor or predecessor. People are arguing about that. Pai Ankh. So she was an extremely important person. She had a very, very beautiful Book of the Dead papyrus, a bit of which we see here. This is a bit which is now in the Louvre. This is another fragment from the same papyrus, also in the Louvre, and this is another fragment of the same papyrus now in the British Museum. Or so there's several fragments of it, and in fact, in the middle of the slide here are all of those fragments all stitched together. So this gives you a sense of the length of a roll of papyrus like this. These objects, by the way, were exactly the kind of thing that people doing illicit digging for the purposes of recovering antiquities to sell on the open market. This is exactly the kind of thing that they were after, because these were small objects which could easily be concealed, easily removed from an archaeological site, covertly taken perhaps across the river from the Theban cemeteries to Luxor for sale to tourists. So perfect. You know, something like a coffin might be the kind of thing that you could sell, and of course people did buy and sell coffins. It was much harder to do that covertly than to sell on something like this, which would be much more easily concealed. The other thing, of course, is if you're a potential collector and you're thinking about transporting items you've purchased back to your home in Europe, in the UK, or wherever it might be, and then putting them on display in your home, then again, small, more portable objects are much more conveniently taken away. And let's not forget as well that the illegal and activity extends to the purchaser as well. You've got to get these things through customs, and again, much easier to do that if you can squirrel these things away. Mariette, who was at this time in the 1870s still the director of the Antiquity Service, the founder of the Antiquity Service and the first director, Auguste Mariette, another Frenchman, had already purchased another papyrus of a lady called Henut Tawi, apparently from the same source. And then in 1878, a man called Rogers Bey exhibited a wooden tablet in Paris. It now has the name Tablet Roger, belonging to a lady called Nescons A, another 21st dynasty lady, and this is now in the collections of the Louvre with the number 6858. So this is a genealogical chart from Aidan Dodson and Diane Hilton's book, The Complete Royal Families of Ancient Egypt, and I've just added red lines here to indicate the individuals who are represented by this material. So as you can see, they relate to some of the most prominent members of the 21st dynasty family in Thebes, the Thebes of these chief priests of Ammon, who had the status of kings in the region and claimed some of the trappings of kingship as well. We'll go into that, by the way, in a little bit more detail, that idea of priests as Theban kings in the next talk on the tomb of Herihor, the lost tomb of Herihor. So having realized that all this material is coming onto the market, Maspero and his colleagues began thinking a tomb has been found here, a tomb of a prominent member of the royal family of the 21st dynasty, or more likely a kind of family vault, a family tomb. So of course Maspero wanted to know where this was and whether there was any more material yet to come to light, yet to be recovered. And so he began an investigation. And he tells us in a subsequent account that he had already by this point undertaken a long survey carried out patiently among buyers and European tourists, which had taught me an important fact. The main sellers of royal antiques were a certain Abderrasoul Ahmed, his brother Mohammed Abderrasoul of Sheikh Abdul Ghorna, and Mustafa Aga Ayat, consular agent of England, Belgium, and Russia in Luxor. So there are not very many images known of them, but the ones that we do have have been widely circulated and reproduced lots and lots of times. This is a detail on the left-hand side of a photo of the Abderrasoul family, actually, but this is just a detail showing Mohammed, the elder of the two brothers, and then above an image of Ahmed Abderrasoul at the opening to the tomb, which it eventually became clear they had found. Both of these images taken a long time after the events of Maspero's inquiry and immediately afterwards. But here they are nonetheless. And this is what I understand is the only known photograph of Mustafa Aga Ayat. He had a house within the Luxor temple. You probably know that before the temple was cleared in the late 18th century, the late 19th century, late 1870s, by the Antiquities Service. It was filled with debris and also occupied by houses, shops, pigeon towers, that kind of thing. So it was only in the 1870s, possibly later as the 1880s, that those houses and then the debris, which is the accumulation of centuries worth of occupation, were removed so that people could visit the temple in the way that we can today and walk around on the ancient floor level. If you've been, you'll know that there is a mosque, the mosque of Abu el-Hajjaj, which appears to be sort of almost hanging in mid-air at a level considerably higher than the ancient floor level. That was the level of all of these houses, including Mustafa Aga Ayat's. The Antiquity Service tried and failed to remove the mosque of Abu el-Hajjaj at the time. The local authorities wouldn't allow it, and so it survives to give us a sense of what the Luxor temple was like up until this point. This is not a great photograph of Mustafa Aga Ayat, but you get a sense of this sort of grand man presiding over things in the Luxor temple, welcoming tourists to Luxor in his role as the consular agent, helping them settle in, making introductions, etc. He was also, on the side, an antiquities dealer. He was able to do that because he had diplomatic immunity. So he was immune from prosecution, and quite willing to make light of this arrangement. So we are told Ahmed Abd-ar-Rasul, when he was questioned, made it clear that he was living with Mustafa Aga Ayat, and that he'd been given to believe that by residing with Mustafa Aga Ayat, he also enjoyed diplomatic immunity. And so if he was to be involved in the antiquities trade in any way, then he couldn't be prosecuted. And in fact, Aga Ayat had told Ahmed and others this, knowing it not to be true, that the immunity only extended to Aga Ayat himself. But he wanted to do this, knowing that this would allow his agents, after Ahmed Abd-ar-Rasul and others, free rein in gathering up antiquities and bringing them to him, thinking that they could get away with it without ever being punished, which was all rather devious of him. But it meant that Aga Ayat was perhaps the leading conduit for illicitly excavated activities and antiquities, which were coming onto the market for sale and being distributed this way to mostly Western collectors. So he's an important figure, albeit one who sits very much outside establishment academic Egyptology. And he features in the accounts of people like Amelia Edwards and Marianne Brocklehurst and lots of others who travelled to Luxor at this time, because inevitably you would meet him. So here's how the investigation begins to play out. On the 4th of April, 1881, Maspero sent the chief of police in Luxor to arrest Ahmed Abd-ar-Rasul, thinking there was enough grounds to do this. He telegrammed at the same time Daoud Pasha, who was the governor of Cana, to authorize an investigation. Cana at that time was the province in which Luxor was to be found. Luxor is now a governorate in its own right, but at that time it was still a part of Cana. Cana, by the way, is the last big town you go through on the way to the Dendera temple. So if you've ever done that visit to Dendera from Luxor, you'll know that you have a drive about an hour north, then you come to quite a big town, quite a big city, then you've got another 5 or 10 minutes to go before you get to the temple. That town is Cana. So this is where Daoud Pasha was based. Ahmed Abd-ar-Rasul was questioned by Emile Brugge, an assistant of Maspero's, because Maspero wasn't yet fluent in Arabic. And also another assistant, Monsieur Rochemontet, who was an Egyptologist also employed by the Egyptian government. And Ahmed denies everything. But on the 6th of April, having received authorization from Daoud Pasha, Maspero sent Ahmed and another of the brothers, Hussein Ahmed, to Cana. All of the notables of the of Gurna. Gurna is the network of villages and hamlets that sits in and around the Theban hills, where the Abd-ar-Rasul brothers were living. They all say that Ahmed was loyal, selfless, honest, would never do anything so awful as to search for or violate a royal tomb. You know, they testify that his character is absolutely beyond reproach. However, Ahmed continues to maintain his innocence, despite, as Arthur pointed out in the chat before the talk started here, despite almost certainly being subjected to torture, the bastinado and other rather nasty and unpleasant ways of extracting information from people. He returned to Gurna in mid-May, at this point demanding compensation from his fellow villagers for his time in prison, and asking them for half the proceeds from the tomb, which they all knew he'd discovered, instead of the 1/5 which had been previously agreed. At this point, the other main brother involved, Mohammed Abd-ar-Rasul, begins to realize that with disharmony between the villages, there's a possibility that the secret's going to come out. So he decided to embrace this, take charge, and went in secret to Cana to announce to the governor that he knew the location of the tomb. Daoud Pasha immediately telegrams the Ministry of the Interior, and they pass this on to the very top of the government in Egypt, to the Khedive Tufik, a descendant of Muhammad Ali, the founder of modern Egypt. A second telegram the following day reveals that Daoud Pasha had, on information from Mohammed Abd al-Rasul, had the location of the source of all of these great antiquities checked and confirmed that it contained more than 30 coffins and many other objects, the presence of uraeus cobras proving it to be royal. So the Abd al-Rasuls, Daoud Pasha, and everybody really knew that the presence of a uraeus cobra at the brow of a coffin or any other image of an individual signified that they were royal, and that therefore they had found something really very spectacular and important indeed. At this point, unfortunately, Maspero himself had just left for France on business, leaving behind Bruges, who we've already heard about, his assistant and assistant curator in the Egyptian Museum, and one or two others to take up the reins. So the Khedive ordered Bruges, along with Theodos Matafian, Ahmed Effendi Kemal, who we see on the right-hand side here, who's described by Maspero as a secretary interpreter, which seems a little bit condescending given that he was an Egyptologist in his own right, and also Mohammed Abdesalam, who was the captain of the Antiquities Service steamboat Le Mencha, to go to Luxor to investigate the tomb itself. When they arrived, a little while later on 4th of July, they found that Mohammed Abd al-Rasul had, as it says here, deposited further objects from the tomb with Daoud Pasha. This is the way Maspero describes it in a later account. Other accounts have it that, in fact, Daoud Pasha had the Abd al-Rasul property searched, and this is how this further material turned up. So Maspero was perhaps just feeling a little bit more diplomatic by the time he wrote this account. In any case, there were more papyri suddenly, again belonging to 21st dynasty women, Mark Kare, Istem Kebdi, and Nescons A. I don't have good photographs of these. They're all in the Egyptian Museum collection now. But this is a black and white image from John Romer's book on the Valley of the Kings of a part of the Mark Kare papyrus. And again, you can see very, very spectacular and beautiful, the kind of thing that would have been very desirable to collectors and would have yielded a very high price, a good amount of money for Mustafa Aga and the Abd al-Rasuls, and by extension, the villagers of Gurna. So these papyri added a few more names to the group of 21st dynasty individuals represented by this burial. We see those with the green here on the genealogical chart. Also, though, strangely enough, the additional material also included canopic jars of Ahmose Nefertari, who was the wife of Ahmose I and the mother of Amenhotep I. A great sort of looming presence from the early 18th dynasty, a very much earlier period than the 21st dynasty, the time of all the rest of this material. So either this was from a different discovery, or it suggested that there was rather more to this tomb than just a 21st dynasty group burial of some kind. On the 6th of July, the party, so that's the museum team, Emil Bruges, Ahmed Effendi Kemal, and co, the governor of Cana's men, with Mohammed Abd al-Rasul, visit the tomb. Bruges wrote, I took in the situation quickly with a gasp and hurried to the open air lest I should be overcome and the glorious prize still unrevealed be lost to science. We will see what it was he found in just a second, but it was, suffice it to say, one of the great iconic discoveries in Egyptian archaeology. So he had found not just a cache tomb. The Ahmose Nefertari canopic jars, it seems, did come from the same place, which was in fact a cache of material from this huge period, from the end of the 17th dynasty right down into the early 22nd. Much of it royal, all of it relating to the burials of the very most high-ranking individuals in the country from throughout that time. So I decided for this talk to go with a 3D image from Google Earth rather than a flat satellite image, two-dimensional satellite image, in the hope that it would show the undulations of the hills and the relative positions of some of these monuments a bit better than a flat image. So this is the area of the Theban necropolis. This is the area of Deir al-Bahari, Temple of Hatshepsut, Mentuhotep Neferhotep Ra, Thutmose III. This is the tarmac road leading up to the Hatshepsut temple with the car park for coaches and things and souvenir sellers along here. This is the Asasif area here. The Sheikh Abdel Gourna Hill is here. So a lot of the New Kingdom tombs of the nobles, which you can visit from this part of the road, are in the hills here. What else can we see? Deir el-Medina is over here. This is the Ptolemaic temple. Valley of the Queens is up here. So this all together is the Theban necropolis, this sort of area here, and the Abu al-Naga hills are over here. Valley of the Kings is a little way behind the line of cliffs behind Deir el-Bahari and behind the cemeteries over here. So it's accessed via this long and winding now tarmac road up to the back, but as the crow flies, it's quite close. And we are going to go in here into this area here. So if we zoom in a bit, this is the temple of Hatshepsut here. The 3D view does distort things a little bit, but still I hope you get a sense of where we are. And the royal cache is somewhere around here. So it's behind this spur of the rock and very much concealed in a sort of corner, if you like, of this little natural narrow bay of cliffs here, which otherwise is relatively empty of archaeological activity, certainly by comparison with Deir el-Bahari here, which is absolutely full of it, of course. So well hidden. No surprise that the tomb had escaped the attentions of archaeologists and everybody else, apart from the Abd al-Rasuls up until this point. Here it is on the ground. To access it, you need to, if you were sort of standing at the Hatshepsut temple, you need to look over to your left and begin walking across the desert. And once you've got kind of around and behind this spur of the rock, you need to walk up this quite steep slope where the people I was with on this particular day are heading. You eventually come to a flattened section with a pathway running along it. And in fact, the opening to the tomb, as I take this photograph, is just over my left shoulder. And this is what you see from the surface. A man-made opening, a shaft descending down into the rock at the base of one of these so-called chimneys, kind of a natural fold in the cliffs, which creates a kind of chimney-like effect, and it's at the base of one of those. It's a roughly square shaft descending about 16 meters down into the rock. The rock here is very friable; it's very fragmentary. So what we're looking at here is not the original shape of the shaft, but the original shape having been widened and opened as rock has collapsed from the face of it. This is a plan, part of a section drawing of the shaft and the opening part of the tomb, which was made during the 1990s, late 1990s, early 2000s re-examination of the tomb by Erhard Graefer and Galina Belova, which has produced really the first accurate plans of the tomb as it exists now. So as you can see, vertical shaft descending down to a sort of opening corridor with a roughly descending floor, which then opens out into a further corridor accessed via a right turn. So this is a plan and section of the tomb as a whole. So this is the shaft here. If we look at the section, this is the shaft in the plan. You head sort of straight forwards, if you like, for a short distance before taking a right turn. And at that point, we're in a corridor labeled C by the excavators. There's then a stairwell, quite a steep and rough stairwell, with a niche on one side here, labeled E. This, at the bottom of the staircase, then leads to another corridor, again descending gradually further down into the rock. This is labeled F, and that finally terminates in a roughly square, roughly square burial chamber here, or a chamber termed burial chamber. Anyway, I've never been inside the tomb myself, so I'm borrowing these photographs from Grafer and Belover's really excellent publication, the Royal Cache TT320, a re-examination. So I put these up because I don't think they're very often seen, these images. Again, you know, thinking about the fact that the royal mummies are so well known, but the archaeological context, the place they came from, not so well known. I wonder how many of you might have seen photographs like this before. This is the first corridor. So we're at the bottom of the shaft here, looking down corridor B, with corridor C opening out to the right-hand side at the bottom at the end. This is corridor C. The dotted line here is intended to show the shape of the corridor as it would have originally been intended before the friable rock on all sides had begun to collapse. It has a very rough appearance now, but they suggest that this is the original sort of shape of this rectangular corridor. This is the staircase at D, with a niche on the left-hand side, E, and corridor F ahead of us at the bottom of the staircase. This is F, full, as you can see, of collapsed rock. And then finally, this is burial chamber G. I don't like cutting off the heads of people in photographs, but I hope this guy won't mind. We still get a sense of the size of the chamber from his presence. And this is looking back out from burial chamber D, back down corridor F, and back towards the entrance. So that's the tomb that Brugsch and co entered very rapidly at this point. But of course, the tomb itself isn't really quite as important, perhaps, as the contents. As we'll see, and this is going to be a recurring theme in this talk. We have very little by way of documentation of the process of the removal of the objects from the tomb. So Brugsch and co visited for the first time on the 6th of July, 1881. The clearance began on the 7th, and it took about 48 hours, as far as we can tell, to complete. That's a very, very short period of time, considering the quantity of material, the fragility of the material, and the logistical difficulty of moving it around and out of a very, very tight space. And we have great cause to rue the fact that the process happened as quickly as it did, and that there was so little by way of documentation and recording done at the time. For this reason, we have basically no images really at all of the position or the archaeological situation in the tomb at all. All we have to go on are the recollections articulated after the event of Brugsch in particular, and then what we can reconstruct from Brugsch's recollections and the material itself. But we don't even have a drawing, let alone anything like a photograph of the position of the material in situ. So for this reason, once or twice in this talk, without wanting to mislead you, I've used, a couple of screenshots from a favorite film of mine. You might have heard me mention it before. The Night of Counting the Years, or Al-Mumia, to give it its name in Arabic. It's an Egyptian film from 1961, which is it's a sort of fictionalized account of the discovery of the cache and the implications for the Abtar Rasuls and the locals, and the dynamic between the educated people from Cairo and the local people in Gurna. The reason I want to use a couple of stills from this is because, as I say, in the absence of any genuine images from the time, shots like this one showing, this is meant to be Ahmed Kamal and an assistant examining coffins as found in the tomb, gives you some sense of what it would have been like. Essentially, the tomb, more or less, we think, from the base of the shaft along all of the corridors and into the burial chamber, was completely and utterly full, almost to bursting, with coffins. It would have been, it seems, more or less impossible to introduce a single further coffin into the tomb. There was other material placed in and around the coffins as well, smaller items, shabti boxes, papyri, Osiris figurines, other items of various kinds, were all connected with burial or funerary rituals, etc. But very, very little space to move. So this is the kind of scene that Brugsch and co. would have come down on. As far as we can tell, and this is one of the great problems with the absence of documentation of the find, is we don't know what exactly was where. And if we knew that, we'd have a much better idea of the sequence in which, the order in which things entered the tomb. And that would help us to understand the sequence of events, because the material in the tomb, as we've already seen, relates to people and burial equipment from lots of different periods. And it would be very helpful to us to know in trying to understand how events unfolded, if we could know the sequence in which they were placed in the tomb. We assume, because the space is so tight, that the things that were found the furthest from the entrance must have been placed in the tomb more or less first, and the things that are closest to the entrance were added last. So they're all sort of done in that order. If there's any consensus at all on the first things that Brugsch would have seen, it is that he saw this coffin at the very first. This was more or less visible as soon as he got to the bottom of the shaft. It's the coffin of a Wab priest called Nebseni, an individual of the 21st dynasty. It contained, however, the mummy of an unknown man, C, and we can't identify this individual with any certainty, but the technique of mummification shows that he was an individual of the 18th dynasty. So on the basis of the technique of mummification and the style out of the coffin and the individual named on it, the wrong mummy is in the wrong coffin. And that is a running theme here too. By the way, the coffins, as I mentioned earlier, are mostly on display, or they have been, perhaps up until recently, on display in the Egyptian Museum, but displayed in cabinets, displayed horizontally in cabinets that don't allow you to see the top of the coffins. You can only really see the side. They're placed usually in threes, a little bit like they're on shelves. So it's very difficult to see them, and very, very difficult to photograph them as well. Believe me, I've tried. And it seems there are very few good modern colour photographs in circulation of the coffins. The same is true of the mummies. Of course, you'll remember that for a very long time, photography inside the Egyptian Museum was completely prohibited from around about, I think it was about 2002 until about 2016. You couldn't take photographs in the museum. They lifted those restrictions in 2016, but they were still in place for the royal mummies. So I don't really have very many good photographs of the royal mummies, I'm afraid, either. So the photos that are in this talk of the coffins of the mummies come from the Cairo Museum Catalogue Général publications, where the photographs are good, but they are in black and white, and they are, of course, old now. So if you're wondering, why is he using all these old photos? That's why. I'd dearly love somebody to go and do a really great publication with new colour photographs of all the coffins and all the mummies. That would be really very helpful, but it hasn't happened yet. There's an idea, maybe. Anyway, the second of the coffins we think that Brugsch saw belongs to a lady called Rai, who was the nurse of Ahmose Nefertari, this great queen of the early 18th dynasty. And this proved to contain the mummy of a different individual, identified as Ahmose Inhapi, the queen of Sekenenre Ta'ar of the 17th dynasty. This is followed by another 21st dynasty coffin of a lady called Duart Hathor Henut Tawi AQ. Hope you're keeping up here, who was the wife of Pinugem I, and this contained the right mummy, so no mixing here. And then the coffin of Sety I, the great pharaoh of the early 19th dynasty, and this contained his mummy. I say this is the coffin of Sety I. It's identified as belonging to him by an inscription on the front, but it's almost certainly, if it was his coffin, then it's stripped of all of its finery, and quite probably it's actually a coffin that was originally made for somebody else. It's not his original coffin. That's why it appears perhaps to be a little bit plain. But in any case, the coffin had come to be used for Sety I by this point. We know that from the inscriptions, and the individual mummified inside was also identified by inscriptions on the mummy wrappings as being the very mummy of this great individual. So already by this point, what seems to have happened is that Bruges made an initial survey of what was inside the tomb. And he says that he was in there for about 2 hours, everything lit by torchlight, of course, or lamplight, and furiously making notes on the inscriptions and whatever else he could see. But it would have been very, very difficult for him to see by any means everything. And he just didn't have very much time. It's been suggested that he in fact didn't even have as much as 2 hours. That might be an exaggeration. In any case, whatever he was doing, it seems if he made any notes, then they haven't survived. But it was obvious to him that he had discovered something very much more than a tomb of a group of 21st dynasty individuals, and he was at least aware that he had burial equipment from lots of different periods. Something else which was recovered, it seems, if we're to rely on Bruges's later accounts, very early on in the tomb, at the turn of corridor B into corridor C, that corner turn, was screwed up this extraordinary object, a leather funerary canopy of Amenhotep D, which is on display in the Egyptian Museum in a rather horrible wooden case that makes it very, very difficult to photograph. These are my ropey photographs from a couple of years ago. You can at least see the cartouche of Pai-Nejem II, relative of Amenhotep D's, and you get a sense, I hope, of the extraordinary nature of this canopy. As I say, it was screwed up and shoved into a kind of corner, and it was pretty much the last thing that came out of the cache. It hadn't even been noticed until the tomb was almost completely empty after this 48-hour period of clearance. It does seem, incidentally, as though the material was comprehensively cleared at this point, but nonetheless, the fact that Bruges missed this until just about everything else had been removed, again, is a sign that things were being done in a tearing hurry and without great care. So this is a reconstruction from the Greifer and Belova publication of the situation in that opening corridor. And in fact, they've added in a 5th coffin here, and the coffin of a 17th dynasty individual, Ahmose Sapair, a prince of the 17th dynasty. That may or may not have been there, and the uncertainty is all due to the fact that we don't have good records. But this plan is useful in showing the extent to which the corridor, right at the very opening to the tomb, and this is the shaft here at the left-hand end, was completely and utterly stuffed full of coffins. So Bruges, Kamal and co, and in fact the Abderrasuls before them, had they wanted to explore the whole of the tomb, would have had to be sneaking past coffins here, potentially clambering over material right the way through the tomb. If they went all the way to burial chamber G, we don't know if they even did that, the Abderrasuls at least, then they certainly would have had to have been tiptoeing around all sorts of treasures. The tomb was absolutely full. This is a reconstruction, again by Greifer and Belova, of the situation in burial chamber G. And again, as you can see, this is also, subjective interpretation. We can't be absolutely sure that this was the situation, but it seems that there were 6 or so coffins, along with a number of other items, jars and other items of funerary equipment, more or less completely filling the space in the burial chamber. We don't know what the situation was in the rest of the tomb really at all. So we have some account of Bruges's, of the opening part of the tomb and the end of the tomb. What was in between, and we are really in the dark about. The material in the burial chamber, the consensus view, I think, if there is one, as to what was in the burial chamber, is that it was mostly material of the 21st dynasty, and more precisely material relating to Amenhotep II, chief priest of Ammon and kind of king of Thebes, and his relatives. So these are the coffin, or parts of the coffin assemblage of Penugem II, very fine, typically 21st dynasty coffins, brightly and elaborately decorated. These are the coffins of Neskhons A, who was his niece and wife. Material of both these individuals had already turned up prior to the tomb's discovery by Brugsch and Co. These are the coffins of Istemkheb D, the owner of the leather funerary canopy, another wife of Penugem II. This is a rather more plain-looking coffin of Nestar Neb Ishiru, who was a daughter of Penugem II and Neskhons. And finally, coffins of an individual who held the posts of both second and third prophet of Amun, priest of Amun, a man called Jedpai Uf Ankh A, who was perhaps the husband of Nestar Neb Ishiru, which would make him the son-in-law of Penugem II. So there's, you'll forgive me, there's a little bit of circularity in the way I'm arguing things here, but for various reasons, it is thought that these coffins were all gathered together in the burial chamber. We'll come back to what the significance of that might be later. Brugsch also remembered or recalled on a later visit to the tomb. He went back to the tomb in January 1882, I think January 1882, a few months later, with Maspero, making his first visit to the tomb at this point, and a photographer, an American called Edward Wilson, who subsequently wrote an account for the Century magazine of the discovery of the tomb, which is largely based on Brugsch's recollections. So not, as far as we can tell, any notes that Brugsch made, but just what he could remember. And he told Wilson that, plunging on ahead of my guide, I came to the chamber where we are now seated. This is burial chamber G. The gilt face on the coffin of the amiable Queen Nofretari seemed to smile upon me. This is the coffin of Ahmose Nefertari, the mother of Amenhotep I, wife of Ahmose I. It's an enormous thing, as we can see from this photograph on the right-hand side, which shows a man in a fez, we think probably Emil Brugsch, possibly Ahmed Kamal, probably Brugsch, next to the coffin, which is standing on end. And this is a typical enormous coffin of a queen of the early 18th dynasty. There are a couple of other examples of coffins like this, as we'll see. He was wrong about the fact that the face was gilded. It had no gilding on it at all. This had all been stripped off. So immediately we have reason to doubt his memory. But he does seem to be telling us that this coffin was present in burial chamber G. That may also be significant, as we will see. It disturbs the unity otherwise of the 21st dynasty group, supposed to have been in the main burial chamber. So that is perhaps the situation. As I mentioned, the clearance began on the 7th of July, and it took 48 hours. The reason it was done, the main reason it was done in such a hurry, is that Brugsch was well aware that even though he was acting on the orders of the Khedive of Egypt, the ruler of Egypt, and he was operating under the auspices of a government ministry, the Service des Antiquités. He had the backing of the governor of Cana, the police, etc., etc. The removal of the objects was likely not to be very popular, to say the least, with the locals. He might not have been aware of all the details, but he will have known that certainly the Abd al-Rasuls stood to lose out by having a great source of income removed from them, but also by extension, the local villagers were likely to lose out as well, and he was going to have to lean on some of these people at least to help him in the removal of the objects. He was clearly very concerned for security, both for the material and potentially for himself and his colleagues as well. And he tells us that he slept with his pistol, and that he ordered he tells us 300 or 400 locals who were employed to help with the clearance the following day. He ordered them to undertake the work completely naked, in order that they had no place to stash little antiquities which they could then squirrel away from them for themselves to sell on at a later date. So he was clearly very worried about this, and this is the reason why everything was done in such a hurry. It doesn't really excuse the fact that apparently no records were made, but still. Apparently by the morning of the 10th of July, everything was down at the river's edge, waiting for transfer across the river to the town of Luxor on the east bank. And by the 11th of July, everything was wrapped and under guard and awaiting transfer to Cairo on the government steamship La Mencha, and quite probably one or more other boats as well. The accounts that we have, by the way, and I will make frequent reference to the fact that we don't have good information. The accounts we have, which are all we've got to go on, are principally these. So in 1881, a publication appeared under Bruges' name in French, La Trouvaille de Derelbahri, with 20 photographs. But as you'll note here, the text was written by Maspero. Maspero was not there. So Maspero must have been relying on Bruges' recollections, a verbal account, possibly letters, possibly a written account. If there is one, it hasn't survived. We're not aware of it. Amelia Edwards, who was one of the great popularizers of Egyptology and an Egyptologist in her own right at this point, wrote an article on the discovery for Harper's New Monthly magazine called Lying in State in Cairo in July 1882, by which time the mummies had made their way to Cairo and were beginning to appear on display. Edward Wilson, the American photographer I mentioned, wrote his account, Finding Pharaoh, for the Century magazine. This was published as late as 1887. And then finally, probably the most comprehensive account of the discovery is Maspero's Les Momies Royales de Derelbahri, which includes not only an account of the investigation, the discovery, but also Maspero's historical conclusions based on his reading of the inscriptions and all of the rest of the material. So that is the fullest account we have. But again, the real problem here is that there's no first-hand record made on the spot at the time. Everything is either later, or it's remembered, or it's second-hand. Nonetheless, and I'm sort of skating over a whole load of problems and inconsistencies and arguments about the interpretation, it seems, I think most scholars would accept that there are two sort of groups of coherent material, or material that we can be reasonably sure about in terms of details and position. One of those is the coffins found belonging to the family of Penugem II. And as I say, not everybody agrees with this, but it seems most likely that they were found all together in the burial chamber. And the second group is this first group encountered in the corridor, which, although again with all the doubts about Bruges' recollections, his description of these and their position seems clear enough. And that group includes, yes, coffins of the 21st dynasty, but also at least one or two of earlier dates as well. And that's significant, again, when we think about this idea of the importance of the position and what that tells us about the order in which they were introduced, and what that tells us about the way events unfolded. Between them, those two groups account for about 10 coffins, but that leaves approximately 36 other coffins which were distributed in between the very opening to the tomb and the burial chamber, presumably just about filling every other space in corridors, mostly corridor C, niche E. It's very difficult to imagine any coffins being stacked on the staircase, and then corridor F. So there we are. Although the way the plan is reconstructed here, it seems to show an empty corridor F, it's absolutely certain that there must have been coffins more or less filling that area. The mummies themselves, and of course it's the mummies specifically that's the kind of everybody's focus, and it's the mummies that are going to be on display in the NMEC and have been on display in the Egyptian Museum up until now. These were of course not visible at the time the tomb was first cleared. They only became visible once they were unwrapped in Cairo in the years following, and it's not clear exactly when this happened. And again, this process isn't fully documented, but it seems fairly clear that by a certain point in 1886, most of the mummies had been unwrapped under the supervision of Gaston Maspero. But just to emphasize the point, that it wasn't as though the lids of the coffins were opened and there was the face of Pharaoh and the face of everybody else involved. These were very carefully wrapped mummies. So to give you an example, this is the mummy on the left-hand side of the slide here of Ramesses III, and you see it in the second image from the right in its unwrapped state, which is the state we're probably more familiar with it in. It's the state we more or less see it in the museum displays now. But the image at the far left is the mummy as it appeared when it was lifted from its coffin by Maspero & Co. Very carefully, completely and utterly wrapped with a rather beautiful ink image of a ram-headed falcon above a short hieratic inscription identifying the mummy for us. And of course, unwrapping a mummy is an irreversible process. Once you've done it, that's it. You can't rewrap these things. So there's quite a momentous decision taken during those early years after the discovery to unwrap just about everything. And I think in some ways a decision which we might regret a little bit now. And it's perhaps a bit unfair on Maspero & Co. to draw attention to too much attention to this. But the photograph on the right-hand side, which shows the mummy of Thutmose III, shortly after the wrappings had all been scissored open and the mummy itself revealed, is rather a sorry sight. This image. I take this image from John Romer's book on the Valley of the Kings, and he certainly is very clear that it's a very sad image of a very great king in a sorry sort of state, absolutely not in the way that he would have been intending to lie in state for the rest of eternity. So I don't particularly want to dwell on the mummies themselves, actually. I hope that's not too much of a disappointment. There is a certain amount, of course, we can learn about each and every one of them individually in terms of techniques of mummification, age at death, any ailments that each of them might have been suffering from. But just to give you a few of the images and perhaps talk briefly about one or two. As I mentioned, it's been impossible to photograph the mummies as an average sort of punter. I don't know if that will change in the NMEC or not. Perhaps that's a sign of respect on the part of the museum authorities. But in any case, it means that I fall back on the Catalogue General photos for the most part. One exception to that is the mummy of Seqenen Tao, which I was lucky enough to get a very close look at for a documentary program a few years ago, part of a series called Mummies Alive. Seqenen, as you'll see here, was found to be mummified with his hands in this very sort of contorted position. Whether or not that's significant or not isn't really clear, but what certainly is, it seems significant, is that the skull exhibits evidence of severe trauma. There's a number of holes in the cranium, which it's been suggested match the dimensions of the blade of an axe. And we know that Seqenen Tao was actively involved in military conflicts with the Hyksos, part of that great battle between the Thebans of the 17th dynasty line and the Hyksos kings towards the end of the Second Intermediate Period. And although Seqenen Tao wasn't the pharaoh to bring about the final defeat of the Hyksos, that fell to one of his successors, or one or two of his successors, Kamose and Ahmose I in particular. It's possible that these are injuries arising from that conflict. So in this way, you know, this particular mummy sheds a little bit of light on the historical situation. And these are just some of the others, just so that you've got some images, really. This is Ahmose Inhapi, whose mummy was found inside the coffin of the Lady Rai, the second to be discovered, according to Brugs's account, within Corridor B, the second one he saw on entering the tomb. She is the owner of a tomb referred to as the Kai of Inhapi in inscriptions, and that's significant, as we will see. She was the sister and queen of Seqenen Tao. This is Ahmose I, the founder of the 18th dynasty. Ahmose Nefertari, his wife, and the mother of Amenhotep I, the lady who's quite possibly buried with Amenhotep I. Some of you, if you were at my talk on the whereabouts of the tomb of Amenhotep I, you'll know that they had a very close connection. We've already seen her very, very large coffin in that photograph with Brugs. This is the mummy of Rai, the nurse of Ahmose Nefertari. This is the coffin and mummy of Amenhotep I himself. His tomb remains unidentified, but his body and coffin were found in TG 320. This is Sety I, one of the best known of the pharaohs and probably one of the best known of the mummies. Such is the extent of its preservation. Ramesses II, perhaps the best known of all of the pharaohs represented in the cache, found to have kind of gingery hair still preserved on his head. Ramesses III, which I believe was the main inspiration for the appearance of Boris Karloff's The Mummy in the Hollywood film of the 1930s, and you can probably see why if you know that film, his appearance in it. This is Nojmet, whose papyrus we saw at the top. Her papyrus, her Book of the Dead papyrus, is one of the items that came onto the market in the 1870s that began to give Maspero the idea that something had been discovered. The technique of mummification had changed by the time of the 21st dynasty, and much more packing underneath the soft tissue in the face and elsewhere was beginning to be used by the embalmers as a way of stopping soft tissue collapse, which is why her face has this sort of slightly puffy appearance. Same is true of Duart Hathor Henit Tawi AQ, somebody else whose material had begun to come onto the market. This is Penugem II himself, who is at the center of this family that appear to have been buried in the tomb as a group. His wife Istem Kebdi, the owner of the leather funerary canopy, in her case, the mummy was not unwrapped at the time, and as far as I know, has never been unwrapped. So this is one instance in which the team at the Egyptian Museum decided that they would leave a mummy in its wrapped state to give an idea of what a mummy in that situation appeared as. This is Neskhont A, the niece and wife, another wife of Penugem II, Nestarneb Ishru, their daughter, and Jedtar Uf Ankh, possibly Nestarneb Ishiru's husband, and his mummy wrappings exhibit the latest date in the tomb, as we will see. So having come across all these coffins and other equipment, having removed them to Cairo, began the process of opening the coffins, unwrapping the mummies. While all of this was going on, Maspero in particular, along with others, would have begun to analyze what they had found, and the unwrapping of the mummies and the eventual analysis of the human remains is a part of that. But prior to that, Maspero and co would have got to work on the inscriptions, and this was to prove extremely revealing in terms of shedding light on events from the end of the New Kingdom and into the 21st dynasty, and it tells an incredible story. The coffins, by the way, in case it wasn't obvious, the coffins were usually identifiable, as coffins are, by inscriptions. Coffins for the highest status individuals bear inscriptions, and if there's anything that an inscription says, any information that it provides, it's most likely to be the name and probably titles of the individual. So there was that way of identifying the owners of the coffins. In some cases, those coffins, where they had been perhaps stripped of their finery or perhaps adapted for reuse, having been used for somebody else earlier, they had secondary inscriptions on them. And that was the case in the coffin of Sety I, a detail of which we see in the image on the left-hand side here. Very clear ink, an ink inscription with the cartouches of Sety I, Menmart Ra, Sety Meri Ptah, and then also a short inscription in hieratic underneath. That, of course, helps to identify the coffin. The same similar inscriptions are present on the wrappings of the mummies and allow us to identify the mummies. The mummies themselves, of course, would be anonymous otherwise, but the wrappings often bore inscriptions like this one on the right-hand side. These inscriptions, the inscriptions on the wrappings and the secondary inscriptions on the coffins, are referred to in Egyptology as dockets, and they relate to usually the restoration of mummies after they had been desecrated by robbers, it seems. Mummies and coffins, of course, could also be dated to some extent on the basis of style. Certainly by the time Grafton Elliott Smith produced his Catalogue Général publication of all the royal mummies from TT 320, also from KV 35 and elsewhere. He and others were aware that the mummification technique had evolved over time, and they were able to identify key features of the technique and therefore to date mummies on that basis. In a similar way, of course, coffins, the style and decoration of coffins evolved over time, so those could be dated, if not identified to particular individuals on certain grounds as well. As we've already seen, in quite a few cases, it was clear from the very beginning that the coffins and mummies had come to be mixed up. And this chart from Nick Reeves and Richard Wilkinson's book, The Complete Value of the Kings, is quite useful in this regard. So we've already seen, for example, that Ahmose Inhapi, the Queen of Sekenenre Ta'a, turned up in the coffin of Rai. Ahmose Nefertari, her coffin contained not only her own body, but that of the cartonnaged mummy of Ramesses III. It was big enough to house two mummies. Amenhotep I turned up in a coffin, which in fact had not originally been his. It originally belonged to a man called Jehuti Mess. So there was a lot of mixing like this, which might relate to ancient times. Some of it clearly did. Some of it perhaps though to more modern times. Many of the burials, most of the burials, had been stripped of their precious items and materials in ancient times. So a good example is this one on the right. This is the coffin of Thutmose III, very great pharaoh of the early part of the 18th dynasty. And as you can see, any gilding, inlays, etc., inlays for the eyes, gilding, which probably would have covered the coffin, has been unceremoniously chipped away using an adze, leaving it in this fairly sorry sort of state. But also, that's ancient activity, we think, but also the evidence of the Abd ar-Rasul brothers appears to have been evident as well. So this is in fact the wrapped mummy of Thutmose III, which would have been found in the coffin on the previous slide. And you can see here a great hole ripped into the mummy wrappings here in the area of the heart. And we think that the Abd ar-Rasul brothers would have been doing this in order to find the heart scarab, which they would have been aware would have been placed in approximately this location on the mummy, this being a nice little portable item which could easily be removed from the tomb covertly and sold onto the market. And a number of the mummies exhibit little holes and sort of damage in these kinds of areas. So it seems very likely that as we've seen, the Abd ar-Rasuls were removing items from the tomb over a number of years, and they were doing so quite strategically. They knew where to look, and they knew where they would find the kinds of things that they could take away and slowly seed onto the market, making a steady income without, they hoped, arousing suspicion. The other thing is that the coffins and the mummies inside them, and sometimes we're talking about a single coffin, a box and a lid with a mummy inside. In other cases, we're talking about nests of coffins. So a smaller coffin inside a larger one, perhaps inside a third larger one, or with a cartonnage mummy case. These would not have been lifted out en masse. It seems they would have been taken apart. So the lids taken apart, the mummy taken out, and each one of these pieces then taken out of the shaft separately. The whole would have been too heavy otherwise, and then they would have been reassembled on the surface. We think that was probably the process. Again, the documentation lets us down here. But if this is true, then it's quite possible that some of the mixing that was eventually observed once the coffins and mummies were examined in Cairo might have taken place at this point. We can't know, but it's possible. In any case, all of this ancient activity and modern activity has led to a degree of confusion. The dockets, which we mentioned earlier, are probably the single most important source of information for what was happening, how the cash came about, and what the process of cashing was at the end of the New Kingdom and into the 21st dynasty. So, as I say, these short inscriptions in ink on the wrappings or the coffins of the mummies are referred to as dockets, and they fall into two types. One of them is much simpler than the other. Type 1 involves simply the name and titles of the individual. So that's obviously helpful, it helps us to identify the owner of the coffin or the mummy, but it doesn't tell us very much more. In the case of type 2, we get a date in which the work was undertaken, the nature of that work, and that would usually be something like a restoration. Restoration is the word in inverted commas that we tend to use now for the process that was going on. What we think was happening was that the mummies were being found violated by robbers in ancient times, and the authorities would then restore the mummy, rewrapping it, perhaps putting it in a new coffin, perhaps adding new amulets, heart scarabs, whatever, jewelry, although less of the precious stuff, of course, by this point. So the nature of that work would be related. The identity of the people who undertook the work would also be identified as well. And that's useful because it allows us to see that the same people crop up over and over again. Same people were involved in the restorations. And we assume, for the most part, that these restorations, as I say, were undertaken as the result of the mummies, coffins, etc., the burials being desecrated at the hands of robbers. So it seems our first point of departure would be that this cache was itself a response to the growing problem of tomb robbery. The tomb robberies were already known to Maspero and co. By the time of the discovery of the cache, thanks to a group of papyrus documents, which we now refer to as the tomb robbery papyri. So we looked in a previous lecture of mine on the tomb of Amenhotep III at this papyrus. Papyrus Abbott belonged to a Dr. Abbott and eventually came into the collections of the British Museum, where it's on display now. It dates to year 16 of Ramesses IX, so towards the end of the New Kingdom, towards the end of the 20th dynasty, and it describes, among other things, a tomb inspection. A group of 9 or 10, I think, royal tombs are said to have been inspected. And the significance for the story of Amenhotep I is that is one of the tombs mentioned, and in fact there's a description of its location, which has set archaeologists running in all directions looking for a tomb that corresponds to this direction. And what the purpose of the inspection was to establish whether or not any of this group of important royal tombs had been robbed. And in fact, at this point in the reign of Ramesses IX, only one of them had. The tomb of Amenhotep I itself was said to be intact. The tomb of a second intermediate period king, Sobekemsaf, had turned out to be violated. The others hadn't, but nonetheless, we know that robbery was going on. The tomb robbery papyri actually is quite an extensive group of documents studied by Eric Peat. His landmark publication is The Great Tomb Robberies of the 20th Dynasty. It's over 100 years old, I think, now, but it's not been superseded. He divides them into a number of groups. I don't want you to read all the text here, but if you look at anything, just have a look at the second column in the left-hand and right-hand halves of the screen, which give the dates of each of these documents. And you'll see that most of them relate to the reign of Ramesses IX, as Papyrus Abbott does, or this era which we call Wehem Mezut, to use the Egyptian. Sometimes this is translated as a period of Renaissance. Wehem Mezut means something like repeating of births, and it seems to have signified a new era which took place within the reign of Ramesses XI, right at the very end of the 20th dynasty. And I'm skating over the details here, but it seems that this marked the transition to a new era in which Ramesses XI himself was ruling from the Delta, from his base at Paramesses. His authority by this point had shrunk, and he had lost control of the southern part of the country, which had come to be taken over by one or more individuals based at the temple of Karnak. and that seems to situation seems to have arisen partly as a result of the declining authority of the king, but also the concomitant rise in the authority of the chief priest of Amun at Karnak. And so this gives rise to a new line of powerful individuals who, in fact, collect together titles giving them authority over all the major departments, the instruments of state, the temple, the economy, the judiciary, the army in the south of the country. But the title they use more than any other, their principal title, was chief priest of Amun. And this gives rise to the split, which is characteristic of the 21st dynasty. So Wehemmezu seems to represent the beginning of this period. And many of the tomb robbery documents relate to this time. So this seems to have been the great time of tomb robbery. The robberies seem possibly to have been motivated by declining economic conditions and possibly a worsening security situation in Thebes in particular, which was suffering from invasion and possibly settlement by migrating Libyans from the west. We talked a little bit about this in my recent talk on TIP Untangled. If you were there, you may remember some of the details of that. So the tomb robberies seem to have been playing out at the very end of the New Kingdom. And as I say, the dockets and potentially the caches as well appear to have been a response to those tomb robberies. Royal and other high status burials desecrated, mummies rewrapped, given new coffins, and potentially moved to new secure locations, caches. But it's possible that there's actually, after a while, there was something else going on as well. And this document, which is part of another group from this period, the so-called late Ramesside letters, is relevant here. This is a letter from Buteh Amun, who was the scribe of the necropolis, and as such, he was the kind of chief administrator of the Theban necropolis, including the Valley of the Kings and all the other areas of the cemetery, including the tombs of kings from other periods. And his name crops up over and over again in relation to the restoration of mummies. His name crops up on the dockets. His name crops up in graffiti outside tombs relating to tomb inspections. And this is a letter written by Buteh Amun, another individual, a guardian called Ka, and the workmen of the tomb, a group of workmen, to Pai Ankh, who was the chief priest of Amun at the time, so the de facto ruler of the Theban region at this point, in the kind of Wehemmezu era when the chief priests have taken over. And it includes a very intriguing passage which in fact quotes an order from Pai Ankh. So Buteh Amun and co write, "We have noted everything about which our master has written to us, namely," and this is the command of Pai Ankh. Pai Ankh is said to have commanded them to go and perform for me a task on which you have never before embarked, and search for it until I come to you. So says our Lord. Uncover a tomb among the tombs of the ancestors and preserve its seal until I return, so said our Lord. We are carrying out orders. We shall leave it undisturbed for you and let you find it ready. So to put that into slightly clearer language, essentially Pai Ankh seems to have said, okay, I want to ask you to do something you've never done before. Go and find a tomb among the ancestors, a tomb that hasn't been disturbed, and wait for me. So the interpretation of this, and this is the interpretation of Nicholas Reeves principally, is that there came a point where the authorities under Pai Ankh began to do rather more than just restore mummies which had been desecrated, and they realized that perhaps there was something in it for them if they could preempt the robbers by getting to these undisturbed tombs first and deliberately stripping them of precious material. And they might have argued that in this way they would have been reclaiming precious materials for the state rather than them falling into the hands of criminals. They might also have argued that they would do this in a very respectful way and at the same time be providing the burials of the kings with more security. But essentially, it seems as though the economic situation had declined to the point, and we must bear in mind that Payank was involved in some sort of civil war at this point and perhaps in urgent need of funding. He decided to take steps to recover this material before the robbers got to it. So this is why we think not only of the dockets as relating to restorations, but also potentially to the reclamation of precious material as well. You might think that, just purely based on the fact that TT320 is a cache tomb that contains the coffins and mummies of New Kingdom pharaohs, who we know must originally have been buried in their tombs in the Valley of the Kings, that the cache represents the result of a single episode, a single event, where the authorities decide, okay, we better hide the coffins. Let's take them from their tombs in the Valley of the Kings and we'll put them in TT320. In fact, the dockets reveal that the restorations and then movement of mummies had been had played out across a whole load of events over a period of over a century. So this process was unfolding for a very long time. It was by no means a single event. And it's the dockets that provide us with this information. So just to go through one or two of the clearest episodes in this. The coffins and mummies of Ramesses I, Sety I, and Ramesses II, so that's the first three kings of the 19th dynasty, grandfather, father, and son, three successive generations of the same family, appear to have been a coherent unit. And the dockets that appear on the coffins and or mummies of all these three individuals make it clear that at a certain point they were all buried in KV 17, which is the tomb of Sety I in the Valley of the Kings. So the tombs of these three individuals were quite close to one another. This is Ramesses I here. His son and successor Sety I built his tomb just a little way along the same side wadi here. They were found in quick succession by Belzoni, hence the successive numbers 16 and 17. The tomb of Ramesses the second, Sety I's successor, is a little way back down the valley on the other side. That's over here, but they were all kept together in this tomb 17 at a certain point. So there's a kind of a mini cache in KV 17, sometime probably around the end of the New Kingdom or slightly later. Further dockets on each of the mummies and coffins. And by the way, some of you may already know that the mummy of Ramesses I was not recovered from TT320. This is a long story in itself. The fragment at the top, the image at the top here, is a fragment of the coffin of Ramesses I. We think his mummy probably came from here, made its way onto the antiquities market, and eventually made its way to the Niagara Falls Museum, if you can believe that, and then eventually was transferred to the Emory Museum in Atlanta, and from there back to Egypt. And it's now, if we're right in identifying as such, on display in the Luxor Museum. In any case, the coffin fragment that was found in TT320 makes it fairly clear that the mummy probably was there. And in any case, the dockets show matching information to the mummies and coffins of the other two. And there are two further dockets which are relevant here. The first of them reads, day 17, it's very precisely dated, day 17, 4th month of Peret, year 10 of Siamen, in order to take them into the Kai of Inhapi, which is in the great place where King Amenhotep rests. The second of these is dated just 3 days later, day 20, 4th month of Peret, year 10 of Siamen, to rest in the house of eternity in which Amenhotep is. So these dockets both seem to relate to the transfer of all three mummies from KV 17 to somewhere else. Firstly, to the Kai of Inhapi, which is in the great place where King Amenhotep rests, and secondly, to the house of eternity in which Amenhotep is. The Kai of Inhapi would seem to be the tomb, and specifically a kind of high place tomb, that's the meaning of the word Kai, of Inhapi. The great place where Amenhotep rests is probably not a tomb, it's probably a general area, a kind of cemetery. So we understand from this that the tomb of Inhapi is in the general area of the tomb of Amenhotep. But the second docket, which talks about the mansion of eternity, the house of eternity in which Amenhotep is, that is probably his tomb. So we think, if we're right in interpreting the dockets that way, that the mummies were moved from KV17 to the tomb of Inhapi and then to the tomb of Amenhotep I. So there's a lot of movement going on here. Inhapi of the Kai of Inhapi is Ahmose Inhapi, whose mummy was found in TT 320. We've already come across it. Her mummy was found in the coffin of the Lady Rai, right at the entranceway to the tomb. Amenhotep I, we've already seen that the location of his tomb is as yet unidentified, not with any certainty anyway, but his coffin and mummy did turn up in 320 as well. So this is intriguing. We have 5 individuals concerned here. Those later dockets seem to relate to 2 different dates, even if they're only 3 days apart, and 2 different locations. So first question arising from this is, where is the Kai, the tomb of Inhapi? It was suggested quite a long time ago now, in the 1930s, I think, by the great American excavator Herbert Winlock, who had done a lot of digging in this general area, Deir el-Bahri and As-Sasif, that TT 320 itself was the Kai of Inhapi. He argued that tombs of this kind, the kind that we see at 320, DB 320, which is a deep shaft at the bottom of a natural rock chimney in the cliffs, is characteristic of the burial of early 18th dynasty queens. And Inhapi is an early, she's a late 17th dynasty queen, in fact. And several other queens' tombs of this period were found nearby. So he suggests that this is 320. Furthermore, of course, all 5 individuals who were mentioned in those dockets, Ahmose Inhapi, Amenhotep I, and the 3 19th dynasty kings, all eventually made their way to 320. However, if those dockets do describe 2 different places, the Kai of Inhapi, and then separately a different place, the tomb of Amenhotep I, and given that they all ended up in 320, finally, we either have to assume if the Kai of Inhapi is 320, then they then went back again. Otherwise, it's a different place. Inhapi's mummy, of course, is found in the wrong coffin, perhaps as a result of mixing in ancient times, perhaps in modern times, a bit difficult to say. But in any case, it was found close to the entrance. If the tomb is the Kai of Inhapi, you might have expected her to be placed more towards the end of the tomb in the burial chamber. But it seems that, you know, she was actually one of the last to be introduced. Again, that mitigates against the idea of that identification. Nicholas Reeves has suggested that a tomb called WNA, referred to colloquially as the Bab el Mualak, the hanging tomb, is the high place of Inhapi. It's about 750 or so meters along the line of the cliffs from DB 320, as this map shows. This is 320 here, and WNA is high up the cliffs here, closer to Deir el-Medina. And this was found in the 1930s to be full of Roman period mummies. There was a graffito inside which referred to the tomb as the Kremasterios Taphos, a Greek graffito. That also means hanging tomb. If that's right, if this identification is right, then the tomb had right down to the present day been referred to as a high place, the high place of Inhapi, the hanging tomb in Greek, and then the hanging tomb in Arabic as well. So that continuity persuaded Nick Reeves that this might well be the tomb. Another candidate, though, is KV 39, Kings Valley 39, actually found some way outside the valley. And you might remember, if you know the story of the tomb of Amenhotep I, that this is one of the candidate tombs to be the tomb of Amenhotep I. However, there are other candidates. And the most recent excavations in the 1990s and 2000s turned up not very much to associate the tomb with Amenhotep I, but some dockets of Thutmose I, Thutmose II, and Amenhotep II as well, all discovered inside the tomb, all dockets of the kind that we find in relation to the caching process. So it seems likely that this was a part of the caching process, and it is in a high place, just beyond the line of the cliffs, over the back of the Temple of Hatshepsut, a little bit down from the top of the cliffs, but nonetheless, it is in a high spot. Also, perhaps significantly, it is on the way in between the Valley of the Kings and DB 320. If you were going from KV 17, where Sety I, Ramesses II, and Ramesses I were all cached together, and heading to TT 320, you would have to go via KV 39. So for my money, this is the strongest argument. The only thing about this is thinking about the tomb of Amenhotep III. If the two dockets relate to different places, I think they probably do, and KV 39 is the Cairo in Happy, then it can't be the tomb of Amenhotep I. I'm okay with that, but there are some people that still believe it is the tomb of Amenhotep I. If TT 320 was not the Cairo in Happy, then what was it? It is possible that it was the tomb of the Penugem II family, this family that's so well represented by the 21st dynasty material. And in fact, that idea is strengthened by graffiti, which are found at the tomb entrance. So at the very bottom of the shaft, on either side of the passageway as you begin to enter the tomb, there are graffiti on either side. On the right-hand side, there's an inscription which records the burial of Neskhons A, the wife of Penugem II. And a second graffiti of a slightly later date records this short inscription: year 10, 4th month of Peret, day 20, of the reign of a king who can only be Siamen of the late 21st dynasty, the era of Neskhons and Penugem, the high priest of Amen-Ra-Santer, foremost great general of the army, Penugem II. It commemorates the introduction of his mummy into the tomb. This is the graffito, which was found broken away from the wall by Graefer and Belova on the ground, reassembled by them in pieces. So this appears to commemorate the burial of at least those two individuals, and you'll remember that the theory is that not only those two, but other members of the same family, another wife, Istem Kebdi, and then a daughter, Nesitar Neb Ashru A, and a probable husband, Neb Jebtar Uf Ankh, were all found in the tomb, quite possibly all of them together in the burial chamber. If they were all together in the burial chamber, then there's a strong case, I think, for suggesting that prior to its being used as a cache, it was the family tomb of Penugem II. Cynthia Sheikh al-Islami has argued that actually the coffins were not to be found there. They were much closer to the entrance, and that the Abdurrasul brothers were generally removing the material that was most accessible, closest to the shaft, and that includes material from these burials. So if Cynthia is right, then perhaps it never was the family tomb of the Penugems, and they were only moved here as part of the caching process as well. There is still the argument that even if the tomb is not the tomb of Inhapi, then it is still an early 18th dynasty or perhaps late 17th dynasty tomb, perhaps of a queen. Winlock's argument that tombs of this type are to be found in locations like this still stands. And this idea is actually strengthened further by the discovery by Graefer and Belova of some vessels in the burial chamber which were crushed by a partial collapse of the burial chamber ceiling. Significantly, they noticed that not only were these vessels smashed, but the contents they contained had run out of the vessels onto the floor. So the contents were still liquid at the time the ceiling collapsed. And these are vessels of the early-ish 18th dynasty. So the collapse can only have happened at around that time. And that helps strengthen the idea that it is a tomb of that date. And it's been argued by David Aston, who dated the vessels, that it may be, in fact, the tomb of Ahmose Nefertari. And to strengthen his argument, he notes that unlike many of the other mummies that were mixed up and in the wrong coffins, Ahmose Nefertari's coffin was found to contain her mummy. And also, of course, we'll remember that Bruges believed that it was found in the burial chamber, in which case, perhaps she was found in place in the tomb that was always built for her. David Aston also reminds us that it wasn't only the coffin and mummy of Ahmose Nefertari that was found, but canopic jars as well, which were among that last set of objects given up by the Abderrasuls just shortly before the tomb was entered by Bruges and co. So could TT320 in fact be the tomb of Ahmose-Nefertari? Nefertari? Well, you'll remember from the discussion of the tomb of Amenhotep I that most scholars, I think, believe that Ahmose-Nefertari was buried with Amenhotep I, and if that's right, could this be his tomb as well? Possibly, but it doesn't seem to be a double tomb, and for my money, there are better candidates elsewhere. So I'm not sure this is right. I think it's probably, there's a good argument to be made to say that this is an early 18th dynasty tomb, but to whom it belongs, I'm not sure we have a really convincing answer yet. I'm aware I'm overrunning, folks. Sorry, as always. We'll get there. We will get there. Stay with me. The last date recorded in the cache, this is significant, I think, is associated with the burial of this second and third priest of Amenhotep III, whose coffin we think was found in burial chamber G. And you'll remember that there's so little wiggle room in the tomb. The corridors are so small relative to the dimensions of the coffins that once the corridors began to fill up, it would have been very difficult to move anything past them. So if we're right in thinking that Jedtai Ank's coffin was deposited in the burial chamber right at the very end of the tomb as late as year 10 or 11 of Sheshonq I of the 22nd dynasty, then it's possible that all the other coffins that were introduced to the tomb that were found in the corridors were only introduced after that point. That is to say, no earlier than the 10th or 11th year of Shoshenq I. So that's a lot later than we perhaps tend to think of the caching process as having taken place, beyond even the 21st dynasty. So we now know that this caching process unfolded over a very long time, possibly as late as the 22nd dynasty, and that TT320, the assemblage of material in TT320 may not even have come together until as late as that. And we know that there were other caches elsewhere at various times. So we've seen that KV17, the tomb of Sety I, was used to temporarily house the mummies not only of Sety himself, but his father and his son, Ramesses I and Ramesses II. Those three mummies were moved to the Cave in Happy. We still don't quite know where that is, but it might have been the Bab el Muallak, the hanging tomb WNA, or it might have been KV39. There's then the Mansion of Eternity, where Amenhotep I rests. Could that have been itself KV39? If so, then it can't also have been the Cave in Happy. Could it have been ANB, a tomb in Dra Abu al-Naga, which has been proposed by Howard Carter and others as the location, or K9311, another tomb in Dra Abu al-Naga? The problem for me with those Dra Abu al-Naga sites as a potential location is that it seems to be a long way away from the sort of path from the Valley of the Kings to TT320. So difficult to imagine Dra Abu al-Naga being involved, but it's possible. And then of course we have TT320 itself, the last dated interment being of year 10 or 11 of Sheshonq, as we've seen. It's likely there were further caches as well, including KV57, the tomb of Horemheb. There were graffiti, faint graffiti found near the entrance, which include lines such as "Carry out the command of Herihor in the Perjet." That's possibly the burial chamber by the scribe of the army, Butahamen again here, in year 4 of, we're not sure. A second and third graffiti there record the names of Kisen Butahamen again, and the royal scribe Jehuti Mose, who's another of the major players in the caching process. And a fourth records activity in year 6. We don't know for sure whether these relate to transfers, removals, inspections, restorations. It's not entirely clear, but it all seems to have been a part of this inspection, caching, removal process. Moreover, the excavators found skeletons and third intermediate period floral garlands of a similar type to some that were found in TT320, suggesting that there were at least 4 restored individuals in the tomb of Horemheb, the remains of them at least, at the time the tomb was discovered by Theodore Davis and Edward Ayrton around about 1907-8. So in fact, this may well have been a cache tomb itself, and it's just that the material relating to the cache was so fragmentary that it wasn't understood as such at the time. But it may well be that it was used for that. Another tomb discovered by Winlock, the great American excavator of the area that I mentioned, a tomb given the number 358, its location just to the north of the Temple of Hatshepsut, around the other side of the bay of the cliffs at Deir el-Bahari, was found here. There's a gentleman standing next to the opening. This is another, like TT320, deep shaft leading to a corridor tomb, which was originally for another of these early 18th dynasty queens. Ahmose married Ammon, who had another of these very, very large coffins, which we can see on the right. But it was also the scene of an intrusive burial of the 21st dynasty of the family of Penugem II, a daughter of his named Naouni, whose burial assemblage was apparently laying disarticulated in a corridor, and that's what we see in the photograph here. So again, it looks like an 18th dynasty queen's tomb reused for caching in Dynasty 21. And then, of course, we have the other of the large caches discovered at the end of the 19th century. By Victor Lorre. This is KV35, which we mentioned at the top. This contained not only the mummy of Amenhotep II himself, who was found in the sarcophagus, but Thutmose IV, Amenhotep III, Meneptah, Sety II, Siptah, Ramesses IV, V, and VI, and then also those 3 unwrapped mummies, including the elder and younger ladies, who we see in the photograph at the bottom right here. All together, when we look at pharaohs of the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties, a great many of them were found to be buried in TT320, and the list is then supplemented by names from KV35. If you discount the mummies of the 17th dynasty kings, who are unknown to us, they might possibly have been hidden in caches elsewhere, but it's, I think, very possible that in fact they remained in their own tombs in Dryad Wal Naga, and that those were subsequently plundered. The remains of several of those burials were discovered in the middle of the 19th century by Mariette and others. There aren't very many gaps otherwise. You can see gaps towards the end of the 18th dynasty relating to the Amarna period. Ayin Horemheb may have been among the mummies discovered in fragmentary forming in the cache of KV57. And then there aren't very many other gaps, but the fact that there are gaps suggests that there might well have been, or still be even, further caches to discover. And then, of course, there's also the fact that we have lots and lots of material which appeared illicitly on the antiquities market from the New Kingdom and 21st dynasty during the 19th century, whose provenance is unknown. But it may well be that some of that material came from a cache which, unlike the case of 320, was discovered by the Abd ar-Rasuls and then revealed. It may well be that there were other caches which were discovered by illicit excavators and never revealed to the Antiquities Service. We will perhaps never know. There are lots of questions still remaining, of course, particularly relating to the precise position of material within TT320. If we could go back in time and just quickly make a sketch plan and take some photographs perhaps of the situation in the tomb as Bruges found it, or even better, at the point at which the Abd ar-Rasuls first found it, whenever that happened, it would really help us to understand what was going on. The date of the initial discovery by the Abd ar-Rasuls, incidentally, is still disputed as well. You'll generally see in the literature that it's thought to have been 1871, but there is a papyrus known as the Prince of Wales papyrus, which was in the collection of the future King Edward VII, Edward VIII, I'm not sure, Edward VII, I think, of England, which eventually made its way into the collections of the British Museum. It's part of the Book of the Dead of Nojmet, the wife of Herihor, and probably Pai Ankh. He may have acquired it in Egypt earlier than 1871, in which case the Abd-ar-Rasuls had found the tomb earlier than that. There's also the issue of the mummy, supposed mummy of Ramesses I, which, if that identification is correct, and if it was in 320, then that was removed from the tomb even earlier, as early, I think, as 1860. There's also the question of the full extent of the material removed by the Abd-ar-Rasuls before 1881. Cynthia Sheikh al-Islami has done an amazing job of gathering together what evidence we have for material they took from the tomb and sold onto the market, but we can't know for sure that she's got everything. There might yet be more material languishing in museum basements, private collections, which might come to light and can be shown to have come from the cache. We also still somewhat in the dark about the precise and comprehensive sequence of and location of the caches in ancient times. Further material, if it's awaiting discovery, still might help us to understand things a bit better. So there we go. I've overrun worse than yesterday, even, but we are now at an end. So then, thanks very much for being here. Thanks very much for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed it. Pretty complicated situation, isn't it? But I hope that helps give a decent overview of the archaeological situation in 320, which is where most of these royal mummies that are so famous now came from. So yeah, thanks for coming. If you have questions, as I said at the beginning, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A box. I'm going to go there first. I can see there's a couple of questions, and I'll do my best to answer those, and then I'll pop back to the chat to see if there's anybody else. So here we go. Questions. Rob asks, did the brothers, the Abd-ar-Rasul brothers, that is, reveal how they came upon the tomb or cache? The story is that they, if I remember rightly, that they were walking in the hills, and one of the goats that belonged to the family ran off and got its foot caught in the mouth of the shaft. We don't know this for sure, but it seems impossible that the shaft wasn't full of debris, if for no other reason than that the modern 1990s 2000s excavation found that just in the period of a century or so since the tomb was first identified by the Antiquities Service, a huge quantity of debris had just blown in quite naturally and filled the shaft almost to the top, I think. So the idea that the shaft could have been clear at the time the Abd-ar-Rasuls found it is very, very unlikely. So if there's any truth in this goat story, then even if it was revealed to them by accident, the Abd-ar-Rasuls were not shy in digging around to see what there might be. And in fact, it seems much more likely that they were telling fibs and actually they were looking for tombs. So there is this goat story. They also say that when they first entered the tomb, one or the other of the brothers realized very quickly that he'd found something spectacular that lends weight to the idea that the corridors were choked full of coffins right to the point of the shaft, the opening to the tomb. But immediately kind of ran out. Immediately came out of the tomb, telling the other people that he was with that he'd seen a spirit, an afrit, to kind of scare them all off so that he could keep the discovery for himself, and that he subsequently went back with a dead donkey, so worried that somebody else would go and steal the prize that he threw a dead donkey down the shaft, knowing that it would then give off a horrible smell, and afrits, spirits, were identified by horrible smells. So this was to strengthen this lie that there was an evil spirit dwelling in the bottom of the tomb, and this is supposed to have helped ward off others who might have wanted a share or to take the whole of the discovery for themselves. But yeah, so there's the goat story, like I say, but I think it's just very likely that they were looking for tombs, and they never did admit to that side of the story. Martin asks, repetition of births, could it mean that's the translation of Wehem Mezut? Could it mean the reburial in general, or only the ritual rewrapping of the individuals? I'm not sure that anybody's made that argument before, Martin. That's an interesting point. I seem to remember actually that Wehem Mezut applies to another period of Egyptian history as well. I'd need to look this up. At which point there is no suggestion that there's any particular tomb robbery that characterizes the period. I can see why you'd suggest that, but I think I'm right in saying that there is another period of Wehem Mezut which has nothing to do with tomb robbery. So it's our understanding is more that the element of birth is a sort of birth of a new era. It's quite, I'm not sure if I said this during the talk, but it's quite often referred to in the literature as the Renaissance, the period of Renaissance. I don't really like that because that word has such clear associations with the artistic and scientific explosion in sort of scientific and artistic accomplishment centering around Florence in the 15th century onwards. You know, it has very clear connections with that. There's nothing of that sort in late New Kingdom Thebes. I would prefer something a bit more neutral, like New Era. But in fact, as you can tell in my notes, I always just write the Egyptian Wehem Mezut. That seems a better way, a more neutral way of translating it. But it's an interesting thought. Thanks. Kerry Ann says, you mentioned there's a possibility of the discovery of more caches. Do you have a rough theory as to the potential location? Thanks for your question, Kerry Ann. Not really, no. I mean, no, not really. I think, you know, in terms of the evidence that we have, we're more likely to establish the presence of another cache as a result of retrospectively looking at material which perhaps came from a cache, and some of that work has been done actually by David Aston. So there is an article by Dave called I think it's called The Third Cache, Myth or Reality. By the way, you might think, why third when we've already shown that there are lots of other caches, not just two. The Deir el-Bahri cache tends to be referred to as, well, it's the royal cache. When there was another cache, which I haven't mentioned at all, I'm afraid, of 150 or 250 burials of priests of Ammon, again of the 21st dynasty, discovered again just around the other side of the cliffs from Deir el-Bahri. That's referred to as the Bab al-Gassus, the tomb of the priests discovery, and it's also referred to in the literature as the second discovery at Deir el-Bahri. So TT320 is the first cache. The Bab al-Gassus priestly cache is the second, hence third, but it's unhelpful really because there are lots of other caches as well. Anyway, I think Dave's article is all about gathering together material which we know exists, which might, we can't be sure, have come from a cache which we were never aware of. I think we're more likely to find a cache that way. There's also, I mean, actually, there's also I don't know if you remember, but at the end of 2019, the Antiquities Service, the Ministry of Antiquities, announced the discovery of, I think it was 27 coffins discovered in a single go from the Asasif somewhere. They never really released very much information about the context, about the archaeological context. Again, as so often, the focus was on the objects, on the coffins. Wow, look, coffins. What might be actually more useful is to know how did they come to all be buried in the same place? Where were they buried? Was this another cache, in other words? We don't really have any evidence to suggest where another cache might have been, unless one of these caches that's referred to, like the Cairo of Inhapi, unless we haven't found the Cairo of Inhapi. If that were to turn up, then notwithstanding the fact that it seems very likely that the Ramesside coffins that were there, we know, were moved, and the tomb, the mummy, at least, of Inhapi herself, was also moved. That there might still be other material in the Cairo of Inhapi. We just don't know where it is. But the discovery of those Asasif coffins, I think, shows that there is still the potential for us to discover caches of material, even in a part of the world like the Asasif, which is incredibly has been the subject of a great deal of archaeological work. So there might still be caches out there. I'm not sure that how you'd go about establishing where. One last thing to say on that. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but one last thing to say on that, and I didn't do much in the talk, but I think there is something to be gained from looking at the locations of the caches we know about. So KV-17 was a cache, KV-35 was a cache, KV-57 was probably a cache, DB-320 is a cache. Those teams are all actually clustered quite close together. DB-358, TT-358 is also in that same area. If you look at those on the plan, they're all in the same sort of area. I'm not sure I was explaining this terribly well, but the idea that a tomb of Amenhotep in Dramat Abu el-Naga might also have been a staging post in all of this seems a bit unlikely to me, because all of those other tombs are clustered together, whereas Dramat Abu el-Naga is really out of the way, and I'm not sure that it makes very much sense to move people sort of all the way over here and then all the way over here, when moving from here to here to here does make sense. So from that point of view, if we were to look for other caches, I think that general area, Deir el-Bahari, Valley of the Kings, Asasif, those might be the likeliest areas. Wow, long answer. Good question. Arthur says, Amenhotep I had a Wehem Mezu. Yes, he did, didn't he? When he took over, probably as he was not the familial successor. Yes, thank you, Arthur. Exactly. So to Martin's question, the idea that the Mesut births of Wehem Mesut might be something to do with caching I think is unlikely. I'm sure tomb robbery was still something that people were aware of at the beginning of the 12th dynasty, but not to the same extent that we're aware of it having been a real problem at the end of the New Kingdom, the era of Wehem Mesut. Thank you very much for those questions, and thanks very much for that reminder, Arthur. Very helpful. So yes, there we go. I'm just going to go back to the chat now and see if there's anything else anybody wants to say. Thanks again, everybody, for coming. Oh, it looks like Arthur has posted some useful links here. Oh yeah, lots of articles. Including, the Reeves thesis is Nick Reeves's PhD thesis on the Valley of the Kings. That became, in a revised version, his book, Valley of the Kings, Decline of a Royal Necropolis. But I've actually used the thesis quite a lot because I don't have a copy of the book here. So that's very useful. Thank you, Arthur. It also looks like TT320 in the Cairo of Inhapi. That's Dave Aston's article, I think. Yes. Well, lots of thank yous. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Arthur, for all that useful stuff. Oh, by the way, I haven't said, but as usual, when I get a moment, I will try to put together a page of notes. And a lot of that stuff, as Arthur has pointed out, a lot of these articles and a lot of the information that I've drawn on for this talk is available, freely accessible online. I'll also put up links to all of the various books and articles that I've used in this as well. So if you want to chase up any of these thoughts, then you'll be able to do that. Jenny says our 9-year-old really enjoyed this. That's great to hear. She's currently learning ancient Greek, Latin, and Sumerian. Blimey, modern day Champollion. I'm suspecting hieroglyphs will be a new addition. Thank you. That's great to hear, Jenny. Dick says, great talking and love and overrun. Thanks, Dick. Oh, Gitta says, thank you. Hello, Gitta. And hi, John, if he's there. Lots of interesting facts. Can't wait to get back to Egypt, says Carl. Yeah, me too. Don't want to think about not going to Egypt. Too sad. Elaine says, I must watch The Night of Counting the Years again and look forward to your next talk. Hoping to go back to Egypt in November 22 in time for the centenary of the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. Yeah, blimey, it'd be a real tragedy if we still can't get to Egypt in time for that. And yeah, I've been thinking about watching Night of Counting the Years again myself. It's a really great film. I'll post a link to that. That's another thing that's freely accessible online. I'll post a link to that in the notes as well. Debbie Brooks says, isn't it interesting that the history of moving mummies around continues today with the mummies recently being moved to their new location? Yeah, I didn't have a chance to go into it, but Salima Ikram posted a really great summary of the movement of the mummies since 1881 at the time of the Golden Pharaohs Parade, or whatever it was called. Because they moved from Luxor, obviously they moved to Cairo. By the way, when they were on the river, going down to the river from TT320 and then on the river from Luxor to Cairo, for miles and miles, people came out onto the sides of the river to sort of salute and wail funerary laments as the pharaohs passed, and it seemed to be a kind of spontaneous reenactment almost of a sort of funerary ritual that would have accompanied the funerary procession of the pharaohs in the time of their original burials. That must have been an extraordinary thing to witness. The Antiquities Service officials were rather worried that this was at least partly motivated by the Upper Egyptians' displeasure at the bodies and perhaps the saleable items as well leaving for wealthy Cairo, but it's a very, very interesting phenomenon nonetheless, and that's also captured in The Night of Counting the Years to some extent. And yes, where did they go? They went first of all to the Bulak Museum, which was where the National Museum collection was housed at the time. Then they went to a royal palace. Then they went to the Tahrir Museum. Then they were taken off display because there were concerns about their sensitivity around displaying human remains. They were then redisplayed in the mausoleum of Sa'ad Zaghloul, was it? I think. So they were displayed then in a funerary context. Then I think they went back to the Egyptian Museum. They were taken off display again at the request of President Sadat, who thought it was disrespectful. And then they went back on display, but mostly covered with linen, a linen sort of sheet, from 1994 onwards, I think. And now, obviously, yes, moved again. Ashley says, KV35 next time. Yeah, I did think, oh crikey, maybe I should have done 2 talks, 320 and then KV35. I think the fact is there's a lot less to say about KV35 actually. but I'll have a think about that. Yeah, thanks, Ashley. Yeah, I will have a think. Carol says your lectures always exceed my expectations, which start high. That's very kind, Carol. Thanks. Kathy says, I second KV35 after a Herihor talk. Oh, okay, that's 2 votes for KV35. Maybe as so often happens when I'm putting together my Herihor talk, I'll get a bit of inspiration for a KV35 talk as well. More, oh, brilliant, another link from Arthur, which looks like a link to the night of the counting of the years. I really urge you, if anybody who hasn't seen it, to look it out. It's a really good film. It's a really great piece of cinema in its own right. But even though it is a sort of fictionalized account of what happens, I think it captures a lot of the important themes and certainly some of the drama of it as well. And it was all largely shot on location in the Theban hills, not actually at the site of the royal cache, but Medinat Habu crops up, and the Colossi of Memnon, and other areas of the low Theban foothills. So, you know, it's not just some other anonymous part of Egypt posing as the Theban necropolis. It really is the Theban necropolis. They did shoot a couple of scenes, I think, at Giza as well, in and around the mastabas there, which obviously in that case is filling in for Luxor. But for the most part, it's shot more or less exactly in the right place. Great film, great soundtrack. For the first, well, more or less the whole of the film, there's this sort of swirling wind noise in the background, and very sort of eerie string music. It's brilliant. Arthur says, possible motivation for housing the royal mummies in the mausoleum of Zaghloul was 2 fingers to his memory by a political opponent. Oh, I didn't know that. Actually, thanks, Arthur. That's something to look into. Yeah, I didn't know that. I wonder who would his opponent have been. I don't know enough about 20th century Egyptian political history, clearly. On that note, I think we're at the end of the comments and the questions. Oh, one more question. Kerry Ann says, also not directly related to the lecture, but I thought I might ask anyway. I'm currently an undergrad studying a bachelor's of archaeology, but really wanting to get into Egyptology. Do you have any tips relating to studying Egyptology, maybe in postgrad, or how to get involved in research projects during lockdown? Kerry Ann, well, first of all, thanks for asking. Good luck with your studies. There are, well, there are, I think, a number of master's degree courses. If there's no Egyptology where you're studying at the moment, so what I did is I did a degree in ancient history and archaeology at the University of Birmingham, but Egyptology was taught as part of that. So there came a point where I really wanted to focus on Egyptology certainly by the end of my second year, and so I then just took all of the Egyptology options I could. I still took away from that a degree in ancient history and archaeology, but with as much Egyptology in that as I could. So if there's no possibility of your doing that, you probably would be looking at moving into Egyptology via a master's degree, and there are a number offered by universities in the UK and elsewhere, which for which you wouldn't need an Egyptology undergraduate degree. They're designed for people who are coming to the subjects for the first time. If you've got a background in archaeology already, then I would think there'd be no problem. If you had a dramatically different degree, like, I don't know, biological sciences or something, depending on the university, they might hesitate. But I'm sure that there wouldn't be any difficulties. So it'd be just a case of finding the right programs. And I'm not involved in any universities. Not really. I do a little bit of work for the University of Birmingham, but I'm not very closely involved with teaching there now. So I couldn't say where all the places to go would be. But in the UK, you'd be looking at Birmingham, where I went, University College London, Oxford, Cambridge, Durham, Swansea, Exeter, Cardiff, Lampeter does a little bit. Yeah, but I think that would be the way to do it. Getting involved in research projects during lockdown is probably a little bit trickier. Again, I mean, I'm not really actively involved in academic research projects really myself. All my work is to do with talks like this one, and I'm just gearing up to, as I have been for a long time, to working on a next book. But those are not really, strictly speaking, academic research projects. I'm not sure what the answer to that would be. I mean, I think the thing to do would be just to get reading, without neglecting your undergrad degree. Yeah, just to keep studying. And Kathy says Glasgow as well. Yes, there's a little bit of Egyptology in Glasgow. Edinburgh also, I think, as well, in the archaeology department. Joanne Rowland is in Edinburgh and works in the field in Egypt. Yeah, so I think that would be the thing to do. If you've got any more specific questions, maybe drop me a line via my website or via social media, and I'm happy to help if I can. But I think that's the way. Possibly a master's degree and keep reading. Okay, folks, I think I'd better leave it there. Thanks as always for coming. Thanks for sticking with me, and thanks for all your questions and comments. Next tomb we deal with in a talk, I suppose, will be the tomb of Herihor. I think I'm decided on that now. I just need to find a moment, as I've been saying, to fix a date and get that all set up sometime in December. What's wrong with me today? Sometime in September. I think it's time to go, isn't it? Anyway, so yeah, just thank you again. Thanks very much for coming. I hope you're all safe and well. Hope you stay safe and well. And I will see you again soon. Thanks, folks. Bye.